So good afternoon. Thanks to those of you that have joined this afternoon. We'll also be recording this for those to watch later as well. My name is Jacob Powell. I'm a General Ag Extension Agent in Wasco and Sherman counties based out of the Dalles. And the last couple of years, been doing a lot of extension programming, trying to address wildfire issues in agricultural lands across the state of Oregon. A lot of this was started with concerns over some of the dryland wheat fires that we've had the last several years here in Wasco County. But I think a lot of these things that we'll cover in this presentation will apply to other agricultural areas of the state as well. And we'll briefly touch on a few things for those of you that are living in more forested environments as well. So I've got a website there that if you're interested in looking at, I've got a lot of the resources in regards to the Oregon OSHA regulations that are on that website that's listed there. So kind of wildfire outlook here. If you're in a grassland setting in the state of Oregon, we could actually have a wild and busy fire season later this season. A lot of that's just we've had such abundant rainfall this spring that a lot of that is going to influence our fuel loadings. And so a lot of the grasses and annual weeds that you see growing around the state right now, those are really adding to the fuel loads that we'll be seeing later in the fire season here. So we definitely are going to have a later start to the fire season, but with all the abundant rainfall, we could see a more active fire season in the rangeland areas. And so just for comparison, this is looking at Nevada, where they've done a lot of quantification of the influence of rainfall. That, for example, 2003, very dry year, they only had 12 fires and only had 14,000 acres burned. However, then we jumped to 2005, they had a very wet year, and the amount of fires increased dramatically, with almost 1 million acres burned in that state that year. So again, just with Nevada, so they had a year that was 4 inches above average precipitation, resulting in 1 million acres burned. And then a couple years later, they only had an inch below average precipitation. And so they had a much smaller amount of wildfires that happened. They've also, comparison Montana, in the forested parts of Montana, they've seen that in wet years, there's a decrease in acreage burned during years that are wetter. And so often that's down to only 10%. The acreage that's burned is reduced to just 10% of what could burn in a more typical drought setting in those forested areas. So looking at the wildfire outlook from the Northwest Fire Coordinating Center, they're saying here in May, Central Oregon is quite dry this year. And even with kind of above average precipitation, the north central part of Oregon and also the western side of Oregon have had dramatically increased precipitation, but Central Oregon has remained fairly dry throughout this and is still an extreme drought in most of those areas. So May looks like reduced fire risk in western Central Oregon. June still kind of stays that way. Then we anticipate that July and August things will start drying out, and you can see the red area on this map here is corresponding with above normal wildland fire potential. And so we can see in August here, we still have a chance that some of these grassland areas especially will be increasing in August once all the fuel loadings that we have dry out. So to start thinking about defensible space around structures that you might have on your property, it's essential that we address the ember issue. So this is showing an image from a wildfire that was happening in California. There you can see a dramatic ember shower there. Those all embers are up in the air from the trees that are burning there. And so if those embers have the potential to get inside of our structures, that's where we see the potential for a lot of wildfires to start burning our homes basically from the inside out. And so I have a series of short video clips here that you're seeing that are from IBHS, which basically they're an agency that they get a lot of funding from insurance companies to test different natural disasters on structures. So those include fires and hurricanes, for example. So here you can see they have this large laboratory that they build these structures inside of, and then they can manipulate the weather and the different embers that are happening. So here they're basically exposing this house to an ember shower that's within this laboratory. And so as you can see, just these red hot embers, you get enough of those that accumulate and are able to basically get in an ember trap, a location that in the structure is like a corner, or gets stuck in the eaves or in your gutters. There's a spot where these embers can land and linger for several minutes. There's a chance it's going to cause the material they land on to ignite. And so here you can see these ember showers. Often they can cause a lot of combustible things outside your structure to start. They can start the gutters on fire. As you can see there, gutters are starting to fall off. It's starting to get into the parts of the roof there. So then those things just keep burning and lingering there longer and longer. And the next thing you know, the house looks like here in the lower right, where you can really see a lot of material coming off that house, and the roof is getting pretty engulfed at this point. So what's the best strategy we can do to prevent this? Well, anywhere that you have ember traps on your structures, try to design it and add screening around those areas so that the embers don't have the opportunity to land on those areas. So especially some of these corner vents that we have in our structures, these vents also allow the embers to then go inside the house as well. It's pretty neat that they have cameras inside these structures to look at how many embers are actually going inside of it. And so here you can see there's some embers going in there. And this is probably one of my favorite images to show, is just when you have vents to block things versus when you don't. And the screening size also matters. So they've done a lot of studies that a quarter inch screening is too wide and does not prevent embers from entering our structures. So here you can see quarter inch screening on the left. You can see there's some fairly large embers that are being allowed to enter that structure, versus on the right, you've got proper 1/8 inch screening, and that 1/8 inch screening is dense enough that's preventing the embers from entering, but it's also allowing that structure to breathe. So that's the other issue too, is that if we get really paranoid and we start, just blocking off all of our vents, that does then lead to additional mold and other venting issues in our structure. So those vents need to be there, but if you use 1/8 inch screening, and again, that's metal screening, not plastic. 1/8 inch metal screening is key to keep those embers out from entering into those spaces on our structures. So here you can see often we have vents on our structures that are not with that 1/8 inch screening. So it's worth taking the time to retrofit some of those when you're able to. If you're also concerned about the gutters, either, hopefully keep them clean is ideal. But if you really want to get involved, using this 1/8 inch metal screening to cover up your gutters is also a strategy to use as well. And also just want to point out during this presentation that a lot of these steps to take to create defensible space, they're expensive to do and they take time. And so often what we really need to do is just come up with a strategy that every year you're going to work on different components of this defensible space puzzle. And then, over the course of 5 years, maybe you have everything addressed. So it's one of those, you try to prioritize those biggest, easiest things that you can get done first, and then continue to work from there. So definitely, if you've got big vents in your structures, just retrofitting those with 1/8 inch screening is a good step to take now to keep those embers out. And often it's not as involved as doing defensible space around the structures with the vegetation. But it's definitely, you need to have a combination of both of those factors taken care of that we'll cover next, that vegetation piece. But if you have great vegetation clearance around your structures, but you have your vents are not screened properly, it can also defeat the purpose. So just keep that in mind, that I would definitely put a lot of emphasis on addressing the vents and then moving out from there as well. So while we're on the topic of embers, this is a house that is in Central Washington, over kind of by Wenatchee, I believe. And I borrowed this from a presentation that Washington Department of Natural Resources did, that overall the structure has very good defensible space around it. And so you can see they have a nice yard. They don't have a lot of combustible material right up against the house. Overall, it looks like it's in pretty good shape here. And one thing I want to point out is just keep a look at this shed here. They're on a well on this property, and so this is their pump shed that they have for their house. So keep an eye on that. So then next thing you know, a wildfire happens around that home later that year. You can see that the structure survived quite well, and a lot of that's thanks to defensible space. Again, like I pointed out, they had a nice clear yard here, but they also did some good thinning of the trees around the home. And so now if you look back at this the pump house, it actually burned to the ground. So why was that the house survived, but the pump structure did not? And so the homeowner, had been meaning to fix this, but on the pump house shed, the latch had broken loose and they had used a bungee cord to keep it shut. And during the fire, the winds got gusty enough and the fire was burning there that it's basically that bungee cord melted. The door came open and it allowed embers to fall inside of that pump house and started on fire. And so I just use this as a great example of the importance of home hardening and getting those preventing embers from entering our structures. That can really make a critical difference as well, in addition to taking vegetation measurements as well. So applying this to some agricultural areas, there's a couple things I want to point out about this picture. One is that I would strongly encourage you, if you got livestock and you have feed such as hay or straw, try to keep those in separate areas of your farm if possible. In this scenario, if one of these piles started on fire from an ember landing on it, most likely both of the piles would burn as a result. So try to don't put all your eggs in one basket, spread across your farm those different feed storage areas. So in case one catches on fire, you don't lose everything that you have. I will say too, at least with this, they don't have a lot of vegetation right up against it that's going to burn. I think this is a lot of knapweed that they have growing here, which is not an ideal invasive weed to have, but you can definitely see that it's staying fairly green later into the fire season. So if a fire did go through here, it wouldn't burn very aggressively through the weeds here. And you can see there's a lot of bare dirt that would create some decent defensible space that fire behavior would die down when it got into this area. My biggest concern though with this picture that I'm pointing out is that a lot of these barns that we have, I just described ember traps in our housing structures. And so barns are the exact same way, that often we've got big vents that we don't have screened properly. And we have big openings at the end of the barn like this, that when a fire rolls through could be a problem. So some people have suggested they've done research on this in Australia, where they have a lot of severe wildfires burning through agricultural areas, is if you have, don't use plastic tarping, but if you have, a somewhat fire resistant canvas tarp and you have some that are big enough, you could potentially use those to drape over some of these openings that we have into our barns. This barn here is a fairly large barn that would be difficult to do. In this case, I would suggest that they maybe actually put some doors on that possibly. But so, last case scenario, you're in a hurry to evacuate from your house. If you got some of these big ember traps, consider covering them up with basically a canvas tarp that's fire resistant, that could potentially prevent those embers from actually entering your structure in those locations. But it's key that you don't pick a material that's going to burn either. So you do want a somewhat fire resistant canvas to cover some of those areas up potentially. So that first section there was kind of focusing on home hardening. Now we're going to focus on the home ignition zone. And so this really is vegetation management around our structures. And so we kind of have three primary zones that this picture is indicating. That we have the immediate zone shown here in red. That's really, 0 to 5 feet around our structures. We have the intermediate, which is 5 to 30 feet out, and then the extended going on from 3 to 100 feet out from those structures. So now we'll dive into what each of those different home ignition zones entails. So the immediate home ignition zone is this area that's right up against our structures. And so really the key here is that we don't have any combustible materials. Like I just showed, embers can fly in and they'll land on that combustible material and then start a fire. And then that fire those flames will then ignite the house. So it's key to keep those areas free of any combustible materials. I like these pictures that, if you've got, a patio with brick is a great way to do this. Rocks or gravel. I know a lot of us like to put bark mulch around our vegetation that we have growing close up against our structures. And they've really shown that that's a big no-no, that those embers fly in and land on that and start on fire. So within 5 feet of your structures, don't be using bark mulch. Really, ideally, you just kind of want gravel or rock. In many cases, often this does not look the most appealing, but if you really want to have a fire sound structure, you don't really want to have too much that's going to burn within 5 feet of that structure. I love this picture of this barn, very fire ready barn. Assuming that they've got these eaves here, somewhat ember proofed with the proper screening. But other than that, you look around the structure, it looks like there really isn't a whole lot of flammable material around that's going to burn. So that's ideal. The other thing that we like to put around our structures as well is that we like to put, firewood stacks underneath our deck. Often we're storing our lawn furniture. Maybe you've got some kayaks or other recreational material that you're keeping underneath your porch. So this is a pretty small crawl space here, but often when people have that bottom part of the house is, a basement built into the side of the hill, they will often have a large deck that goes out over the ground, and then they'll store things underneath it. And that is a great place to store things, but it's key that people screen those out with the proper screening so the embers can't fly in and land underneath those decks and start a fire that's going to also burn the structure. So definitely keep some of those flammable materials away from immediately up against the house. The other thing is wooden fences. If you really want to get serious about defensible space, we ideally should have non-combustible materials where these can connect to the house. So this fence here, nice wooden fence, but connects all the way up against the structure. So it would be a better idea to use metal or some sort of other non-combustible material to actually connect it to that structure. So again, looking at more agricultural areas, this is pretty good immediate defensible space that right here up against the structure, you can see they were using livestock in this area. And so there's really not a whole lot of vegetation on this side of the barn that's going to carry a fire. Again, the one issue is here, though, we do have that wooden fence connecting up against the wooden barn. We've got some of these large open windows too that could be an issue if we were concerned about embers. Some thicker grass here on the other side of that fence, so that could also be grazed or weeded or just basically mowed down shorter so that it would have more relaxed fire behavior if it did start on fire. This is another view of that same barn, though, and here you can see that we do not have good immediate defensible space. A lot of this dry brush here would easily carry flames up against the structure. So in this case, you'd want to weed eat that, or if you have livestock, they're willing to consume some of that vegetation. That's also a great way to do so as well. I won't dive into specifics during this presentation, but also herbicides are also a good tool to use in some instances. There are some good pre-emergent herbicides that you could put down in the spring that would prevent vegetation from getting very aggressively thick right up against your structures. And I will say with that too, be careful what sort of herbicides you actually use up against your actual living residence. But if you're doing this around your shops and barns on your property, a lot of these pre-emergents are fairly safe to use in most of those cases. So now jumping out to the intermediate home ignition zone. And so here we now are 5 to 30 feet out from the house. To describe this, often people have used the phrase basically lean, clean, and green. So you can see you want vegetation mowed back and kept short, so keep it lean. Keep it clean by removing a dead material that's going to burn more readily than a living plant material. And then also keep it green if possible. So really 5 to 30 feet, really keep the yard looking nice and green. Once you get beyond 30 feet, it's not as big of a concern. I will say in this picture with the structure here with the ornamental junipers growing around it. So these ornamental juniper trees, it looks like they're almost in the immediate home ignition zone. But just a word of caution, if you have juniper trees like this, you really do not want those within 30 feet of your structures. They burn really hot and readily. They contain a lot of volatile oils that, they look nice and green, but once a fire gets in there and gets cooking, the amount of heat that those can release is extraordinary and poses a risk to firefighter safety, and also increases the chance that structure is probably not going to make it in that wildfire. I really like this picture here of a farm housing for temporary farm workers during their harvest season. And you can see, they've got really good gravel around that immediate zone. And then in the intermediate home ignition zone, they really do have a nice, lawn that's being kept short, green, and lean, just like you want. Another thing to consider is if you do have trees around your structures that, ideally we really don't want seeing those within 5 feet of your structures. I know sometimes you really like them for shade, but ideally at least have that 5 foot separation distance. And then in the intermediate home ignition zone, this picture is a little hard to read, but basically when we have individual trees, or you have a clump of 2 or 3 that are together, you want to keep those clumps at least 18 feet apart from each other. And the 18 feet is referring to the tops of the trees. So the bases could easily be 18 feet away, but you want the tops of those trees 18 feet apart. So that way, if one of those clumps catches on fire, it's not going to cause what we would call a crown fire. That's not going to cause the rest of the trees in your yard to catch on fire. That it'll keep it isolated to that one clump and really decrease the chance that you're going to have all the trees around your structure on fire at once. Another picture here to think about. I really like this lawn in this case, really lush and green. Even this field next to their house, you can see definitely some drier grasses in the forefront here, but in the background close to the house, it looks shorter. And so, ideally that could maybe be a little bit greener, but I think it's short enough that the fire would burn through there. Very short flame lengths would burn through that grass, and they would hit the green lawn here and go out. The one thing, like I just was talking about with the trees though, this large tree right next to the house definitely poses an issue with how the sides of the tree here are definitely within 5 feet of that roof of that house. So that could definitely pose a risk in that case. With these steps I'm mentioning, it's important to realize it's a balance, that we don't want it to look like a desert around our house either. So it's a balance that, sometimes it's okay to have a few, but this tree looks big enough to me that, I wish it was spaced out a little bit further from the house. Alternatively, you could keep this tree and just remove some of the limbs here so they wouldn't be going over the top of the structure like they are. That could also be a strategy to use. The fruit trees that they have in their yard, those look properly spaced to me, that, that doesn't pose much of a wildfire risk given how those are spread out. So now going out to the extended home ignition zone. So now we're 30 to 100 feet away from our structure. And in this case, often it's not worth using the resources to water that, radius within 100 feet of our structure. That's using a lot of water to keep that area green, especially if you're in more of a dryland area. So ideally, just remove any dead plant material that you have out there. Dead plants have much lower fuel moistures, and so they will catch fire much more easily, and they will release more heat when they do burn. So in this picture here, you can see there's a lot of rabbit brush, it looks like, that those clumps are fairly spread apart. All the plants seem to be healthy and living. It looks like maybe there's a dead plant there, but for the most part, this is a pretty good living stand that these shrubs are going to stay fairly green and have a higher fuel moisture content later in the fire seasons. When a fire does happen, it's going to burn through here slowly and with really relaxed fire behavior that's not going to threaten firefighter safety or your structures. So ideally, the biggest thing I would stress within 30 to 100 feet is keep the vegetation short. If you do have trees, keep them thinned. Again, ideally, you want the tops of those trees 18 feet apart. That might not be realistic if you have a lot. So try to maybe work on keeping those to clumps. So you have clumps of, 3 to 4 trees. They're at least separated from others by 18 feet is one strategy to use there as well. So ideally, keep it clean, remove any dead plant material, keep it short. And, often in some of these areas, if it's in a dryland area, consider trying to do some sort of landscaping or seeding project that you're putting in vegetation out here within 30 to 100 feet that will stay green, like this rabbit brush, for example. And it will also be something that you don't have to do as much continuing maintenance on. You don't have to constantly be going out there mowing it all the time. It just stays green throughout the fire season. It takes a lot of work to get something like that established, but it can be a big time saver once you do. So yeah, often just weeding and mowing or grazing those areas is also another key area to keep the fuel loading to a minimum within that 30 to 100 feet zone. So this is looking at more of an extended home ignition zone, 30 to 100 feet out if you are on a forested property. And so this is a ponderosa forest that is in Wasco County. And so you can see there's not a lot of vegetation in the below the trees here, which that's ideal if a fire goes through. The other thing that you do want to work on with trees 30 to 100 feet out is you don't want to have any ladder fuels. They're going to allow a fire burning on the ground here through the grass to burn shrubs that are then going to carry the fire up into the trees. So this is a very good defensible forest that you don't see a lot of ladder fuels. They're going to carry fire up into the canopy of the trees here. The base of these trees is fairly well spaced. To get picky, I think some of these trees could maybe get thinned out a little bit further. Just giving the tops of the trees more distance from each other would maybe be the next step to take. But overall, this forest looks to be in a pretty good defensible state if a fire was to come through here. If it looked like this right up against the structure, I'd be more worried. But if you're 30 to 100 feet out, this is a somewhat acceptable amount of defensible space to have here. So again, thinking about more dryland environments, like I said, this is ideal that this grass here, they're keeping it well mowed and short. And so, and I don't believe that the farmer irrigates this that frequently. I think it's just green given the time of year that it is. But that's the other thing too, is if you mow or graze some of these areas, it will allow the grass to try to regrow and keep it in more of a living state versus the drier grass that's further out that's going to have more extreme fire behavior if a fire got in here. And again, great gravel road here. So often consider where you try to build extended home ignition zone. If you can incorporate a road or other feature that you have on your property, can also be a great way to even further extend that defensible space out. So a lot of agricultural areas, sometimes we're storing a lot of equipment out in those areas. And so this picture shows that, right in the forefront of the photo, the fuel loading is kept pretty low. But as you move out, you can see grass starts getting higher. And really, for firefighters that come in and defend some of these structures, if they see areas that the fire is going to start burning into agricultural equipment or other, junk essentially that's on your property, that's going to cause them to take a second thought if they really want to be in there when some of those things start burning and they start releasing a lot of toxic fumes from burning as a result. So I really encourage people, keep your property cleaned up. If you've got areas that you're storing equipment like this, just keep the grass really short so that firefighters can see where those materials are at, and also that if a fire gets in there, the flames are going to be fairly relaxed as well. This is just another picture of defensible space. This is a couple years earlier on that same barn that I showed you earlier. And really why I'm showing these pictures, I just think it's great if there's landscaping or gardening that you like to do, try to put those in locations that are going to also help as defensible space around your structures. So just looking at the front here, you can see the garden is fairly well cleaned. We've got good living plants. And so if a fire went through here, it would take a lot for flames to actually burn up against the structure. However, like I said, we also need to worry about embers as well. And in this case, there's a lot of openings in this barn that a lot of embers could easily get in there and burn that structure down. So like I said, defensible space is a lot of work. So a key part of that is prioritizing where you want to build your defensible space first. So obviously I would, say any structures that you're living in or tenants or temporary farm workers are living in, that should be our priority to build defensible space around. And if you have some of these other barns or shops that are kind of lower priority, I would say try to address that ember issue at the forefront and at least get material address that immediate zone and maybe part of that intermediate zone as well, just to decrease the risk of a fire really threatening that structure. And also some of these structures that you might not prioritize as highly, if they're a ways away from your other structures, that definitely would help put them lower on the list. But especially if you got an older barn like this right next to your living structure, then you would want to do a lot of defensible space on this, because if this goes, there's a good chance it could cause your living structure to go as well. Another picture here, think about defensible space. One thing that I did not comment on yet is, I commented about ladder fuels, and sometimes the ladder fuels are actually the lower branches on the trees. And so it's kind of a rule of thumb that you try to remove like the bottom third of the tree, have the bottom third of that tree limbed up so there's no limbs on it. There's also a rule of thumb that, if this is a really tall tree, and that 1/3 is, over 10 feet, that's a little excessive. But, at least on a bigger tree, try to have that, lower 5 to 8 feet limbed up, ideally on some of those bigger ones. These are short enough. Obviously, you would not want to limb them that high, but, at least a couple feet, remove those lower branches so they're not going to be a ladder fuel. This house, they have a nice Another tree further back here, this Doug fir, it looks like it's awfully close to the house, so that would cause me to be concerned, especially given that's a log home made out of wood. That could pose a lot of risk to that structure. So in addition to thinking about defensible space, where our structures are located in the landscape can also change how much distance we need to have in our defensible space calculations. So often that extended home ignition zone, you know, we're going 30 to 100 feet out from those structures. Sometimes we have to double that distance if that house is on top of a hill, because slope has a big influence on fire behavior. And so this image here is showing that basically when you're on a steep slope, the flame lengths are more closely aligned with the fuel above it. And so that allows the flames to more easily ignite fuels above it. And also, as you know, hot air rises. And so as a result of that, the hot air that fire is generated is going upslope, and it's preheating the fuels above it, drying them out fairly rapidly. And as a result, allows the fire to have faster rates of spread and also have increased flame lengths. And all this hot air that's being generated, if your home is on top of this hill, all that hot air is sending all the embers and everything straight at your structure. And it's also, you know, preheating your house as well. And so that's why sometimes we need to double that extended zone, at least if we're on top of a structure, top of a hill. Another thing is, if your house is at the bottom of a steep slope, be aware that a fire could cause a lot of rolling debris to roll down slope down on your structure. And that poses a risk for firefighter safety, so they might not be as likely to get in there to defend your house. And it also means that there's a good chance you could have falling debris that could roll down, land up against your house, and start a fire that way as well. So unfortunately, a fire is fairly complex, and so it's just another variable to think about this with slope. And so this slide here is just pointing out the slope effects on fire rate of spread and flame length. And so when our slopes are 0 to 20% steep, we're really not going to see a huge impact on fire behavior. But then once we get to 20 to 40% slope, you know, increasing basically, once that slope starts increasing, the flame lengths double with each increment of increase in slope. That flame length is going to increase. Here you can see, you know, from 20 to 40, flame lengths double, but once you get a 60 to 80% slope, the flame length triples. And you can see the rate of fire spread increases impressively here as well. So just, you know, that 40% slope, rate of spread is going to be 4 times faster, but then you get to that 80% slope, you can see the rate of spread 14 times faster. And this, the +1 mile per hour wind is basically explaining that, you know, just simply by having slope increase by that amount, it's basically the equivalent of having your wind speed increase by, 2-3 miles per hour. So that's the other big variable too that can really make it a big difference in if structures make it or not, or how easily a fire is contained. Is just how quickly is that fire traveling. And so it's kind of like a rough rule of thumb. But if the wind speed, for example, the winds are coming out at 30 miles per hour, the rate of fire spread is going to be at 1/3 that rate. So the fire would be spreading at 10 miles per hour if you have a 3 mile per hour wind gust. And likewise, if that wind is pushing it up a steep slope, that's going to be an additional combination here as well. So all these variables can really change what that fire behavior does on that given day when a fire does occur. The other thing too I'll say about slope is what side of the hill you're on can make a big difference. We know that our south-facing slopes tend to have lighter fuels, but these lighter fuels are also flashier and easier to ignite and burn. And the fires are going to burn more rapidly up these south-facing aspects than often will burn slower on our north-facing aspects. Often the north-facing aspect, though, we do see more fuels on those sides because often it retains moisture better than south-facing slopes. So in some cases, that north-facing slope, if it's hot and dry enough in the summer that everything is really dried out, that north-facing slope could actually burn hotter as well, just because it has more fuel loadings in those areas. So just keep that in mind as well. This is a structure that last year In 2021, there was the Sunset Valley fire that occurred just outside the Dalles. That fire started fairly quickly and burned very rapidly. That caught a lot of people off guard. And so just luckily, this structure here was saved, but you can see the structure on top of the hill, and you can just kind of see by how dark the ground is there that was burned, that the fire burned extremely hot and rapidly up to the structure. The only reason this house was really saved as well is the fact that firefighters got there in time to defend this structure. And you can see, luckily, they do not have a lot of fuels, or at least they don't any longer, but they kind of had some decent defensible space that firefighters were able to get up there quickly and get water around the house. Otherwise, that structure probably would have been a loss. So I talked about prioritizing what structures to do defensible space on first. The other strategy too is how do you prioritize what part of your structure you work on first. And so this Venn diagram here is just showing an example of kind of combining the concepts I've just mentioned. That areas that are on a south facing slope that correspond with areas directly above a steep slope, and also where the dominant wind direction would be pushing a fire, that really should be the side or area of the property that would be your priority zone to address first. And so just an example here as well. We have a structure here, kind of steep hillside leading up to it on the left here, kind of a general southwest facing aspect. And let's say, for example, the wind tends to come out from the west the most frequently. So during the fire season, we mainly have a west wind that would be pushing a fire up the steep slope here. So the blue here is showing that that would be the dominant wind direction side of the property where the wind would be pushing it. Then you have your steep slope that aligns with that. And then it's also, like I said, a south aspect. And so really this here would kind of be your priority zone that I would really say, build some good defensible space, keep the grass especially short on this side of your property. Like I mentioned, though, they do have another issue here that on the other side, they have a lot more heavier fuels that they might also want to do some thinning work in here as well. But, I'd say for starters, they'd really want to address the flashier side of the property that when a fire goes through, that's going to be moved very rapidly through that area. So again, a lot to think about, but just some ideas here to help you kind of prioritize where to prioritize defensible space on your property. The other thing to prioritize is that I will say in Wasco County here outside of the Dalles, in Sherman County as well, and some other counties further east, that in 2021 especially, we saw a lot of small fires that were started by transformers on power lines. And so here you can see there was a fire there was a transformer here that a fire started on, and the landowner actually saw this fire start. And if you want to know the full story, there's actually a squirrel that was involved that was up by this transformer, somehow got electrocuted, was ignited on fire as a result, and then dropped to the ground and started a fire that there was extremely tall ryegrass surrounding this power pole that fire just took off. And you can see it even damaged some of the orchard trees there as well because of just the heat from the fire when it burned through here. So what this means is that wherever you have transformers, I would really encourage you, go out there and weed eat, mow like a 10-foot radius around that pole. So if an ember or spark fell, that ideally it would fall into really short, dry grass. But if it is kept dry, it still could potentially ignite. So I really encourage people really weed eat aggressively around those areas. Consider using the use of an herbicide such as even Roundup, or if you can get your hands on more aggressive pre-emergent herbicide. I know there's a pre-emergent herbicide called Fierce that does a really good job for burn down control around some of these. So basically, we don't want a lot of we do not like seeing a lot of bare dirt on the landscape because we run into issues with soil and water conservation, that we see a lot of erosion with a lot of bare dirt. But a 5-foot section around some of these transformers on these poles could be a good area to just try to use some of those pre-emergents to prevent things from growing in those areas. But for sure, I would just encourage folks this month, get out there and weed eat around any of the places that you have a transformer on a pole like that. So the other thing with defensible space too is, what type of vegetation do you allow to grow on your property? Like I said, we don't want to look like a desert, but we also don't want to use plants that are going to cause dangerous fire behavior. So looking at this picture, hopefully you can see that we have a lot of these ornamental juniper trees here along the windbreak. Like I said, those are a really dangerous tree to use because of how hot they burn. I will say I do like this short field. I like that how they have it nicely mowed short right next to that. But these trees definitely pose a fire risk. But I will also say that sometimes having these windbreak lines can help, that it reduces the wind speed up against the structures. And in some cases, it can allow embers to land in our windbreak and not land on our structures. But if it lands on a windbreak with junipers that catch on fire instantly, that also doesn't do a lot to help us. So I would really encourage people to use plants such as lilacs. I can't speak for where everybody is out of on this call, but I know in Wasco County and some of these drier areas, lilac trees can get established fairly well. They don't require a lot of watering. And even throughout the fire season, they stay fairly green. So, if an ember landed on one, it would be pretty extreme for it to actually cause the shrub to catch on fire. So you also see I have a link here that OSU has a fire resistant plants for home landscapes publication. If you click on that link there, that'll come up and kind of goes through basically the plants to watch out for, and it encourages you some of the plants that do well in some of these drier areas and also are fire resistant. So another part of this defensible space puzzle is if you are an agricultural producer, you've got really large property, it might be worth trying to put in a fuel break. And so why would you want to put in a fuel break? Well, ideally, it disrupts the fuel continuity. So when a fire is burning extremely hot and gets to that point, the fire behavior will go down. And it, what's really important is that it creates a safety buffer for firefighters to get in there. They see that you have a fuel break. They're like, okay, this is a safe place to be. And often in many cases, these fuel breaks, they don't cause the fire to stop in it dead in its tracks, but does cause the flame lengths to get below 4 feet. Often firefighters, for them to actually engage a fire directly with water, you need the flame lengths to be lower than 4 feet. And so that allows them to get in there safely and more effectively puts it out. So, other goals of a fuel break, this picture here is showing, obviously, gravel road is a fuel break in a sense that's disrupting that fuel continuity. But the other thing is we want to reduce vegetation in these areas that have volatile oil. So example, we don't want these juniper trees that burn really hot. In many cases, rabbit brush and sagebrush can also have volatile oil, so they can burn slightly hotter. Rabbit brush will burn a little bit hotter, but it's really sagebrush that we've seen a lot of volatility out of as well. And so you can see here this picture, it's a field break in the Great Basin. So they've got a gravel road, and then on top of that, then they basically have mowed the sagebrush so that there's less fuel when a fire goes through here. I will say there's a caveat, though, that often in rangeland areas, if we mow the sagebrush, we then get increased grasses that move in. And those grasses, depending on what they are, if it's cheatgrass that moves in, it basically is just creating a bigger fuel load than what was there to begin with. So keep that in mind if you are doing a lot of mowing shrubs. Keep an eye that you could have a lot of flammable grasses that move in instead. So be careful with that. So considerations with the fuel break. So, you need a big enough one that's going to be effective. But if you don't have a huge property, it might not be economical for you to put in this huge fuel break. So really, scale is key. The other considerations, be strategic with where you put these. Put it in a place that actually makes sense. Can firefighters actually get to it quickly? Is it, if it's right next to a road, then that's a great place to put a fuel break, because firefighters can already be in there with their trucks. You don't have to worry about trying to go down bumpy road to get to this fuel break where they can actually stop the fire. In this picture is just showing you different considerations on what to do with the fuel break. So this is one example that a lot of the wheat producers, especially when they have a field that's in crop with wheat, basically they will just use a disc to create an area with, bare dirt, maybe a little stubble, but basically, especially along these roadways, if there's an accidental spark that comes up, or somebody is careless and throws out a cigarette, it's not going to cause a crop to burn. It's going to, maybe land the ditch, cause something to burn here in the stubble, but it doesn't have anywhere to go. It's just surrounded by dirt. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is just to mow some of those areas. This is outside of Mosier with a vineyard outside of Mosier, and they basically each summer they just mow this short. They have a sign here that says fire break, not for parking, because often people see these areas and think, oh, what a great place to park my car. But not such a great place when you see how dry the grass is there either. So basically, they just have mowed the spot that, if a fire is burning down the slope here, firefighters can easily get in here and put the fire out because the fuel is so short in this area. It's a safe place for them to be. Again, grazing is also a tool to use, but there's a balance. You don't want it to look like a feedlot that's, just extremely overgrazed. This picture here, you can see, the grazed area, the grass is much shorter than outside of it. I will say from a grazing standpoint, this is starting to look a little bit overgrazed, so you don't want to cause permanent damage to that field, but you do want to keep the grasses short. So it's a balance there as well. The other strategy is, how do we encourage or plant plants that have higher fuel moistures later in the summer? So a lot of our grasses dry out pretty quickly, and then they burn fairly readily and rapidly. But like I was showing you that picture earlier, there's a lot of knapweed around the barn there that I showed you. That knapweed does have, it's going to stay much greener later in the fire season. That, even in September, the chance of that actually burning in September is pretty slim. So I've been doing some research in Wasco County of using different forbs, not weeds, but actual forbs you buy seeds for that you can actually plant to create a vegetative fuel break. I will say we were seeing some struggles there. That what we're trying to plant here is, there's a weed kochia that's a noxious weed, annual kochia, that's an annual plant that grows every year. But we're looking at using what they call perennial forage kochia. And you can see the more scraggly plants here that are darker green. Those are perennial kochia plants that are coming up, and they've used those in parts of Idaho as very effective fuel breaks, that they seed large areas with this forage kochia, and then they basically can just leave it alone. And, basically after the first year, they might have to come through and use some herbicides to control grasses that come up. But after that, they basically can leave these fuel breaks alone for, 10 years at a time without having to come back and remow it every single year. They're not having to come through and disc up the soil. Basically, it's just there and ready to go. So that is another strategy to use. Just be aware that you could have some weed problems. You can see here there's very thick mullein that's moved into this area where the fuel break is at. And so sometimes it does create additional problems that you're gonna have to deal with. But again, this is it's a long-term approach. So just keep that in mind, that these green strips or vegetative fuel breaks are also a strategy to consider. Also, with defensible space, do you have a water source available for firefighters to use or for you to use? And so this picture here is showing that we've got fairly large water storage tanks that this landowner has installed. I like the size of these. Just also be aware that if you're using plastic tanks, those can potentially catch on fire and burn. The chance of an ember landing on one of these and melting it is slim, I would say. But there's definitely the chance that, if it's real close to your structure, or you don't have good defensible space around your water tanks that are plastic, you could have a risk of those melting during a fire and not having that water available. So have water tanks available. The other big thing is, often when you have a wildfire, the power will be turned off. And so if you're depending on an electric pump to move that water, suddenly you're out of luck. And so ideally you're on a hill that you can have these tanks high enough up that they can just gravity feed into where you need it. Or possibly do you have a generator or gas powered pump that is fairly reliable to move the water with instead. The other thing too with wildfire readiness is, sometimes you have a real small fire that happens. And if you've got water there when you need it, you can put it out fairly rapidly. It's great to have some of these bladder bags or Indian pumps, as they call them. Often these store about 3 gallons of water that you can then spray out. And so 3 gallons isn't much to work with, but if it puts the fire out immediately when it's small, you've saved yourself a lot of work just by having a small amount of water ready when you need it. Just briefly, some things you consider if you really are on a farm and you have agricultural equipment. This picture here is showing what they call a slide-in unit that this guy was able to put on the forks on his front end loader of his tractor. So this is another great thing that basically you're retrofitting and using what you already have available. And here you can see that it's ready to go there. Another thing is, do you have pressurized water tanks that you can use? And so here you can see that these are basically hot water pressure tanks that you'd have in your house. And so a lot of farmers have been very, use a lot of ingenuity, I would say, and basically taking these pressurized water tanks and put them on the back of their combine or on their tractor. And what's really great about these is they're pressurized and they're ready to go. And so, you know, you have to keep, like, the air gets pressurized at the start and you have to check it once in a while. But, you know, instead of having to worry about starting a gas-fired pump or electricity, these water system tanks are already pre-pressurized. All you have to do is pull the trigger on the hose nozzle and the water is readily available. So that's another strategy to possibly consider if it might fit into your property. Another thing to consider is other larger pieces of agricultural equipment. So after 2018 fire season here that was so extreme, a lot of the wheat producers now have their own fire suppression equipment. And so this is an actual old military troop carrier that was converted by the farmer, that he basically took the troop carrier seats out of the back. He added a large plastic tank, and then he also put a what they call a monitor on the front. That this is basically a nozzle that he can control from inside the cab. So he has a lot of water readily available on this truck that he can provide to firefighters if they need it. There's also the nozzle here that he can spray on the fire in addition. He also has a hose reel on the back that he could pull up and spray a area that's burning down. And so by having this monitor too, it really allows him that, you know, if it's just him in the field, he can easily drive around the perimeter of the fire, spraying water and possibly put it out. You know, getting into big agricultural equipment, if you have a disc, that's a big asset that you bring to the firefighting front. Just it's a risky business running these discs, especially this picture here. This guy is really getting close to that fire. He doesn't not have much of a safety margin if things go wrong. And so you can see that he's going around this on basically the flank of the fire and getting kind of close to the flames there as a result. But the one thing I'll say on this that's the most dangerous is often the newer tractors, they have different emission standards, that when that exhaust system and the air intake, when that air intake gets too hot, that's going to result in the equipment getting too hot. And often, basically, the air intake, the engine suddenly gets so hot that suddenly the engine has to turn itself off, basically, because the engine thinks that it's overheating because of all the hot air coming off the fire. And the tractor suddenly will drop to an idle. And if you're just stuck in the field like here, you have no safety zone to go to. And those flames easily go over the tractor. And unfortunately has resulted in several deaths in the last couple of years, that people have died. You're getting too close to the flames. The tractor drops to an idle, or potentially something breaks on the disc and you get stuck. And so just being, you know, making sure that I'm communicating to folks that be really safe when you are using these. Ideally, you're disking a fire line right next to a road. So if the fire does suddenly change course or direction, or if the tractor drops in an idle or something breaks, you can just pull off into the road in a safety zone that the flames are not going to overrun you. Really just walking through some real basic fire suppression strategies that, you know, a lot of the cases where you live in these rural areas, you might be the first one on scene with some of these fires, or it's your own property. So you're a very vested investment in putting it out. So, you know, obviously when you have a fire, call 911. Those first responders are going to be the best people to have once they arrive there on scene to help put out the fire. But when you're the first one on scene, you know, what are some strategies you could use to put some of these out? So obviously, you know, a fire extinguisher, an ideal place to start. Some of these pictures I'm going to show here are from a research trial that they did in Australia. And basically they were doing different experimental burns in wheat fields and basically documenting what the impacts were in terms of fire behavior. So they ignited this test plot, and this is 21 seconds after it got started. The plot is 160 by 106 feet wide. And so just showing that already 21 seconds, this fire is already expanding quite a bit. The size of the plot here, you know, it's maybe burned a little bit of the way down there. But basically, you know, the idea with wildland firefighting is often the saying is anchor, flank, and hold. And so, you know, the idea of anchoring, and most of these grass fires in agricultural areas basically going to anchor it into what they call the black. And so you're going to start at the heel of the fire here where it's already burned. And so that way, by anchoring in where it's already burned, it gives you a good place to start your firefighting efforts off of. If you just started trying to put in a fire line here in front of the fire, that fire is going to overrun you fairly quickly. So again, here you're seeing that, you know, the fire is expanding out. So you're going to start working the fire from the black where it's safe to be in there. And I really like this picture here that ideally that when you put some of these fires out, you start from the black and work your way out. And so you can see here that this fire truck is in the black. And so ideally, you know, why would you want to be in the black? Well, in the black, there's no fuel left there. So if the fire shifts directions or anything, you're basically already in your safety zone. You're going to be safe in that fire. The fire is not going to overrun you. There's no fuel for it to burn through. So basically, again, the black here, and you basically start working on the flanks of the fire, the sides of the fire here, where the fire behavior is a little bit more relaxed than the very front of the fire. So after 37 seconds, the fire continues to burn. It's getting longer here. So again, anchor, flank, and hold. You would continue to work on the flanks here, try to spray water on those flanks. And basically, really where you want to be using a disc is if you're way out in front of the fire, you basically put in your fire break, and then when the fire catches up, it won't burn it over. Another thing to consider is when do we have hay fires that happen in agricultural areas. So this is a really unique picture that there was a load of hay that caught on fire on the side of the road. And, you know, pretty quickly that fire started throwing spot fires, that this trailer's on fire and they didn't get it out quickly enough. So then it was throwing spots into the rangeland or hayfield on the other side of this that then they also had to deal with. So that's another safety consideration is once these fires get big enough, sometimes you can throw embers out in front of the fire that cause spot fires to happen and the fire starts to grow. I really just like this picture here, just showing this guy working on a brush rig that he's fighting the fire from the black where it's safe to do so. So just really encourage people to do not get on the unburned side of these fires, that they can easily overrun you and put you in some very dangerous positions. All wildland firefighters use this expression LCES, which stands for Lookouts, Communication, Escape Routes, and Safety Zones. And so basically just keep your head on a swivel, be aware of what's going on. I like this rear mirror of, you know, always be looking around for other safety when you're dealing with some of these fires. Lookouts meaning that everybody's keeping on what the fire behavior is doing. You're able to communicate with everyone. And then it's important that you have escape routes that allow you to get away from where the fire is at to a safety zone that's not going to, that's a safety area that if the fire was to go burn through there, you would survive just fine. So again, that's why if you're in the black already, that's a great safety zone to be in. So often the question is, you know, well, what makes for effective fire suppression? And so kind of as I just stressed, being at the right place at the right time with the right tool is key. So, you know, often having these smaller, more portable options for water is a great way to carry some of that water so it's available when you need it. And also being at the right place, that you're in a location that, you know, you're not on top of a steep hill where the fire behavior is really increased. You're in a good flat area that you can safely engage the fire. And the other thing too is be careful with what type of materials you're wearing. So this video here just goes over not wearing synthetic fibers.
Workright Uniform Company, welcome to Watch It Burn. We're gonna burn, 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 baby. If you're wearing a compression t-shirt at the gym, you probably are trying to feel the burn. If you're wearing a t-shirt at work where fire hazards are present, for example, if you're a firefighter, lineman, or working oil and gas, feeling the burn is the last thing you want to do. That means you need to make sure your t-shirt is flame resistant. This polyester shirt is not flame resistant, so let's light it up and watch it burn. See how this one melts? Clothing made from polyester like this t-shirt can actually melt onto your skin when exposed to heat and flame, potentially making the burn injury even worse. Flame-resistant fabrics are different because they either self-extinguish or simply don't ignite at all. Watch what happens to this flame-resistant shirt. No melting here. Much safer than the first one, right? Would you rather be wearing this one? Remember, if your abs are on fire at the gym.
So I just really like that video. That the other thing I stress to landowners too is when these fires show up out of nowhere, it's important that you rapidly change into clothing that's going to be safe to be out there with the fire. So this video shows that, wearing synthetic clothing, such as, your workout clothes, it might allow you to breathe better. What if that clothing catches on fire, it's going to melt and actually stick to your skin, causing really severe burns. But if you wear cotton clothing, cotton typically won't actually ignite till it gets over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a very safe fiber to be wearing. So really stress that you're wearing, good leather boots, and you're wearing cotton jeans and a cotton t-shirt, preferably long sleeve cotton t-shirt, gloves, and those are going to keep you safe, and it's going to reduce the amount of radiant heat that's getting to you when you're possibly engaged with putting a fire out. And often a lot of these landowners are not even trying to put the fire out. They're just trying to rescue their farm animals or doing other projects on the farm when this fire is showing up. And next thing you know, they are, wearing the wrong clothing at the wrong time, and they can get severely injured as a result. So really stress that you have good clothing and change into quickly when these fires are arriving. This gentleman here is on the Rentham Market Road fire, and you can see that he's wearing excellent protective clothing. That he's got good leather boots. He's got good leather pants. Looks like a denim type, thicker but breathable long sleeve shirt to keep the radiant heat and embers off of him. So I really encourage people have a bag of clothing like that ready to go out the back door that you can quickly change into when you see a fire coming. So just real quick, touching on some of these OSHA regulations, some of the online courses I have developed help address what some of these new regulations are. And so the Oregon OSHA regulations that came out to start with, basically, just if you are a farmer and you have employees on your property, if you're a farmer and you just work for yourself, or you have family support that help you on the farm and they're not employees, you don't need to worry about this. But if you actually have paid employees, they do want you to have basically what they are referring to as an emergency action plan, basically having a wildfire emergency plan in place in writing, have a fire prevention plan for your farm equipment, do a job hazard analysis for your personal protective equipment that your employees might need to wear to protect them from the fire. So like I was saying, just simply wearing cotton is a good step in the right direction. And then if those employees are going to actually engage in suppressing fires, then have them go through some initial training. So at least, if an employee gets hurt, you can at least show to OSHA that, look, I trained them as best as I could to be ready for this potential hazard that's on my farm that they helped me with. So a lot of text on here, but again, basically just having this emergency action plan in place, having a fire prevention plan, having this job hazard analysis form completed for wildfires as well. And so there's kind of two different tiers of firefighting engagement that employees on a farm could do. So one is you have a piece of equipment that starts on fire like this. If it's still small enough, that employee can just grab a fire extinguisher and put it out with the fire extinguisher. They don't need to go through a bunch of additional training. But if the fire like here, if it continues to burn, it's getting out of control, and it turns into something like this next picture, that's when it's a much larger concern. And suddenly, it's either, they're pulling out the farm disc to disc around this, or they're grabbing, a big hose off the back of the truck to really spray, several gallons of water on this to try to put it out. That's when suddenly they need to have some additional training if they're going to actually engage a wildfire like this. It's much more than just putting out a fire with a fire extinguisher. So Oregon OSHA is kind of referring to this, and you have initial incipient stage where it's fairly small and you can put out with a fire extinguisher. And so if that employee does not have additional training, this is basically, they try to put out with the fire extinguisher, it continues to burn and spread. That's when they need to just leave the scene. Or if you expect them to at least, potentially try to stay engaged and try to put it out for a little bit longer, that's when you might want to put them through some basic, wildland firefighting training, make sure that they're wearing the correct clothing, and that you're giving them the appropriate tools and equipment to deal with a larger wildfire. So if you are expecting them to engage in wildfires more deeply, they need to be trained in basic wildland firefighting. Basically, they just want documentation. They go through some sort of training that covers fire behavior, fire control, and fire line safety. And the degree of specialization is kind of up to what you expect your employees to do. And I think the good thing with this too is if you have employees that they're already a volunteer firefighter, or you are in a rangeland fire protection association which they are trained in putting out wildfires through, that will cover Oregon OSHA's expectation here. That will actually exceed what they want you to do. So just document that if your employees have that additional training. So I'm offering 2 online classes. One of them is already completed that will help address some of these Oregon OSHA regulations and also cover more detail the stuff that I've discussed today to really think about defensible space. And so this first class, Wildfire Preparedness in Agriculture, basically the modules cover the different aspects that are mentioned here on the screen. And you can find out more at this registration link here. The course does cost $25, but it's convenient that you can take it whenever you want. You can do it at your own pace. And, ideally should take, around maybe 3 to 4 hours to complete. And so the good thing is, you can just plug away with that for, an hour a day, and you could easily be done with it in a week. And so just kind of gives some additional ideas to be more prepared for these wildfires that we're seeing increase across Oregon. I'm still working on this agricultural wildfire behavior and suppression online course that will cover more kind of suppression tactics and safety that I was talking about at the end of this webinar here today. So again, some additional considerations to talk about there on the screen. Ideally, this class is if you have employees that are being more involved in suppressing the wildfire, this is the type of class they should maybe go through. Also, if you're a rural landowner that maybe there's a fire that you could be the first person responding to and you just want some better safety considerations, I think this class would be great to do as well. And even if you don't plan on having to engage in a wildfire, if you have to evacuate or run away from a fire very unexpectedly, this class provides a lot of good safety information to hopefully keep you and your family safer out there. So that concludes what I have for this webinar today. I appreciate your time.